All right, so first up on the show is Keaton Frieberg, a law partner with Texas Suits who specializes in real estate and business transactions and litigation. Keaton, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
So you're interested in real estate investing. Why is that?
You know, my family's been involved in real estate investing. My dad's really big into it. I've kind of seen his growth in a very short time frame. I mean, he started only maybe 4 years ago. I was like, Dad, you should do this. And he's like, I don't know. And then finally he jumped in and he did it. And he's picked up, I don't know, I think he's at 10, 12 properties now within a couple of years.
What kind of properties is he picking up?
Mostly single family, or he picked up a few duplexes here recently. So he's slowly starting to get a little bit, scale up the size of the real estate a little bit.
And the single family stuff, is that for long-term rentals?
Yes, all of it. He has started to do some Airbnbs, and so that has been pretty fruitful. I think he's going to probably switch a lot of his model over to Airbnb just because it's been so working out so well.
Isn't the hard part of Airbnb's giving up so much of that revenue? Don't they take like a pretty good sized cut, Airbnb, or no?
They do. I don't know that when he works out his math, it's way more than it would be. He makes way more than he would on long-term rentals. So it's a little riskier, definitely, but he has enough long-term rentals to where I think his risk is covered, so everything for the short term is just all profit.
Okay, and I know Heather's got questions for you too, but before we get into that, do you have a disclaimer or something you're supposed to put out?
Yeah, I gotta get
just
the
go ahead and do it. Just do it.
Out of the way.
Just do it.
All right, so the information on today's recording is not legal advice. The information provided is not a substitute for and does not replace the advice or representation of counsel. So if you have a specific situation come up, go reach out to an attorney.
And that's really should go for the internet as a whole, right? No, wait a minute. I Googled it. I'm pretty sure I have this type of disease or whatever.
Yeah, please don't take a podcast as your like tried and true information without actually.
But they said
that's a good point.
Yeah. I heard it on TikTok.
But judge.
But if you come and sit down with me, then you can rely on the information.
Right.
No, I'm kidding.
I'll be right there in the courthouse.
Right. Well, I think he's my lawyer. Is that a conflict? Wait a second.
Does this count? Well, if we're talking about real estate investing, one of the things that I always find interesting is people always say, oh yeah, I got into it a couple of years ago. It sounds like the hardest part is that first transaction. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Definitely. Yeah. I think for a lot of people, well, from what I see, it's really capital. So coming in with capital and then just navigating the first transaction is really huge. I mean, you walk a lot of people through their first transaction, and I think for a lot of people, it's a big mystery. And so yeah, the first one, I think once you get it out of the way, you kind of understand the process and a little bit of what you need and what goes into it. I think from there, starts to compound on itself. Okay.
So speaking of capital, what are some creative financing tools that you would suggest people look into if they're just like starting out in real estate investing?
Yeah. So there's many that for investors to choose from, but some that are more common right now are subject to transactions, wraparounds, which is a subject to inside of a wraparound transaction, but or maybe seller financing. Then all of those are creative financing tools that don't necessarily always include or require a ton of capital down.
Okay, so let's
break that down just a little bit.
Layman's terms.
Sure.
What's your favorite one?
So, well, I think the easiest way is to start with the subject to, because it's kind of the foundation to the wrap transaction. So a subject to in its simplest form is just taking a piece of real estate subject to the pre-existing mortgage or the underlying mortgage that's already in place. So I think these are always done or illustrated well in some sort of an example. So if Mark has a piece of real estate and I want it, and I don't necessarily, maybe I don't have the credit, or maybe I don't have the down payment to go the traditional financing route, I'll reach out to Mark and say, hey, Mark, maybe for a number of reasons, maybe you're not in a good financial position either. And I'm like, hey, can I purchase your piece of property? And he says, sure. Well, because I'm not going to go through the creative financing route, all I have to do is I have to get Mark to sign over title to the property, just like you would if you're buying a car or something like that. You're just signing over title to the property, which is in the form of a deed. And but there's always the fact that Mark still has an existing mortgage on the property. So what do you do with that? Well, you have through a series of documents, I am going to take Marc's mortgage over, and it'll come with that transfer of title. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it's basically like I'll take your mortgage and pay out the difference. What happens to that difference in equity?
Right. Well, and that's where the creative part comes in. Maybe I give Marc, 20 grand, 30 grand, who knows, for this particular situation, depending on how much equity is in there. So I give Marc the difference, or whatever amount we mutually agree upon, and from there he hands over title, and I start making those mortgage payments directly to the lender.
Do you see a big cash exchange typical as when this type of deals get made?
It really depends on when these deals are done and how. So there's kind of a few reasons why subject to might occur. One is maybe someone's behind on their payments. Maybe they're facing foreclosure. So when you have a seller whose back is against the wall, at that point, there should still be consideration, some sort of large cash exchange. But it kind of depends on the timing, because if they're going to go through foreclosure, they're about to lose everything. And so if an investor or somebody comes in right then and there and is able to pick up the property, it kind of creates a win-win situation, because they were about to lose everything, but now they're going to get some sort of capital, and then the investor also picks up the property. So it can sometimes. And then the other times is that right now the reason that it's such a big deal is because interest rates are so high that when you're taking that over that pre-existing note, you're taking it subject to a much lower interest rate. And so it's a really big deal for some people.
See, that's when I was doing my research on this, that was the thing that hit me, was that you're going to want to keep those lower interest rate mortgages because you can come out ahead. Let me get your opinion on it, because this is a tougher question,
Sure.
But is it predatory in nature?
So I think that depending on the way that the transaction is conducted, it can be. I have seen files come across my desk, or cases come across my desk, where there has been zero consideration provided. And at that point, I really do believe that's absolutely predatory in nature. I think you got to kind of look at the totality of the circumstances, see, how much is left on the note. What is this property really worth? I think it's more of a fact-intensive question to figure out whether or not it's predatory in nature.
But I would say too that it's very emotional. It's not just facts. It's also going to be emotional, because the person about to lose their property and take the big hit on their credit, they're freaking out.
Absolutely.
And then the investor is salivating at the mouth, because they're like, okay, I got something here. This is a great deal. I can't wait to tell everybody what a great deal I made, kind of a thing. So there's a give and take, but I think ultimately it does present a win-win situation. I'd say by and large. What are your thoughts on that, Eddie?
Some case by case scenario. I can see where you're standing from, to where that client needs to get it off their hands. I get that. But me, when I call myself the people's realtor, and I look out for the people, to me, I don't like the way it sounds, because I want them to at least walk away with something, and they still get that loan against them, right? Like they still have the loan on their. Mm-hmm. So they can't go out and buy another home most cases. So it's kind of like last case scenario, here you go kind of thing. Once, like you said, investor, awesome, I just won. But for the people, like, man, like you just lost your home. It's something you couldn't afford. So I get that part, right? So you're helping them out in that scenario. But we're always trying to get them from where they're at to the next point. And sometimes I don't want to say get sucked in, but when the investors touch them first without going to a real estate agent and getting some, at least, hey, you know what, you should do this first before going that route. In some cases they go, they're in foreclosure. I had those calls like, hey, I got to sell my house in 2 weeks. Like they're going to come take off, and that may be a scenario where maybe it may do them best. But I've had those where I'm sitting down at the table, coffee table, talking like, hey, let's talk numbers. And they come and hit me with, I'm going to lose everything.
Right. But to that point, though, they got themselves into that place.
That's true.
So it's like, look, I understand charity, but this isn't a charity situation. It's a business situation. And if they can come away with their credit intact and a win, it may not
Cash
be a great
in their
win.
pocket.
Cash in their pocket, you know what I mean? Then it's like, everybody kind of wins on that. So I really like the concept of the deal, but just like everything, there's going to be the emotional component of it, that once it's the fleeting side of it, it's like, oh, and then it's like, well, how much did I lose? 2 years, 3 years down the road, they might be upset about something. Do you see, Keaton, like down the road where where these things can go sour? On this type of transaction thing?
Yeah.
Give me an example.
Okay, I want to touch back on a little bit of what Eddie said real quick. So yeah, absolutely, I agree. The only when I think that the win-win is really created is especially with that foreclosure just knocking on the door. I mean, there's been times where, and actually involved in a lot of these subject to transactions is actually a temporary restraining order, where you have to go to the judge and say, Judge, look, this one's under, we have a contract. We just need a little bit longer so that we can stop the bank from foreclosing on the property. It doesn't always work. It's case by case scenario, but that's how close. That's how imminent this issue is sometimes. And so
procrastination is part of the game.
I think it comes down to transparency too, especially, you know, as we're seeing a shifting market, we're seeing increased interest rates come up. We're seeing prices drop. I mean, I've just been keeping an eye on realtor.com. I see price cuts, and there's a certain percentage of the population that in a couple of years finds themselves in need of a move. They have to move. And if you stare down the barrel of decreased pricing, the last few years of inflated pricing and fees, they may be looking at an L if they did not put a ton of equity into their home when they originally bought it. So there's a bunch of different scenarios where this can come up. But if everybody just clearly understands, I think that's the line between predatory and non-predatory is, do they understand what they're getting themselves into? Is it benefiting the seller in some way? And obviously it's benefiting the investor, but if you're transparent about it, that's the key feature.
Well, the investors come to the table, they're prepared. You know, they've planned, they're ready. And unfortunately, in a lot of these situations, the homeowners, they haven't planned and they didn't do well, or they overestimated, underestimated, whatever the problem is, but something bad happened to them. And that's just the nature of the world.
Yeah, the emotion of money, unfortunately, comes up again and again and again when we see problems there. Yeah. It's just some people, they want to, they want to ignore the problem, or it just gets too much. So these situations arise. So
let's talk about the risks.
Sure.
Talk about some of the benefits already. We didn't go through line by line, but so some risks for the buyer.
So for the buyer is getting, not knowing their numbers, not having a professional know, what their property is worth, given the fact scenario as a whole. Not knowing, how much equity do I really have here? What's fair for me in this situation? Really, I think that's the big risk. Another risk,
foreclosure.
Yeah. Another risk is if for some reason, which as long as you have your documents right, which this is a very document intensive process that goes in here. There's a ton of documents. I think there's total. Some of the ones that I use, we're looking at probably over 50 to 70 pages worth of forms here, but you are kind of, in some sense, I mean, you do have recourse, but you are kind of trusting that buyer that they're going to make that payment. And so, for the rest of the loan, which is, it's definitely, you can't say that's not a risk. So
right, because their credit's at risk is what you're saying.
Yeah. What's the legal recourse someone could go? So say this happened, they sold it Wraparound, they got all the documents squared away, and the investor doesn't pay. What happens then?
The investor doesn't pay for the initial one, or they're not paying on
they're not paying on the mortgage.
This would be a breach of contract sort of situation. That would be their recourse. They're not doing what they said they would do pursuant to our agreement.
So let's talk real quick, because we're almost out of time on this one, but risk for the sellers.
Risk for the seller, a buyer coming back and saying, that maybe these weren't fair terms or something like that, or them not doing the documents properly. I mean, there's a ton of disclosures that have to go out to everybody. And if you're not sending out those disclosures, or if you're not following the property code to a T, then this could come back around and bite you.
So there's something called due on sale clause. What's that?
Yeah. So the due on sales clause, it's in almost every promissory note, and every promissory note is accompanied by a deed of trust. And it's in the deed of trust, and what it says is that, hey, if you transfer title, basically what it says is that if you transfer title from your name to somebody else's name, it can or may trigger the due on sales clause, and which means that the lender can accelerate the note. They can say, hey, look, whatever the rest of the balance is on the mortgage, it's owed and due. And so, especially with interest rates rising, it's kind of a convenient time for banks to call notes due.
Yep.
And so something that I always tell all of our investors, everybody that's involved, that, hey, look, this is out there. Some investors don't care, because they're like, well, I have a reserve and I have all of these properties, and if one of these notes gets called, I'll pay it off and I'll refi it or something like that. But that's what it is.
Well, and the bank really, they made the loan to person A.
Right.
Right. And now person B is paying it. That's a little bit not necessarily square, but I guess as long as, it happens all the time. It does
Right.
seem a little weird.
I think the banks are in the business of making money. They're not really in the business of trying to figure out as long as they're getting paid in most scenarios, I think that they're usually good. But that's,
Are banks predatory, do you think?
Here's where the podcast versus the radio comes in. We can get into predatory
I'm
lending.
sorry, we just lost audio on Keaton there. All right, Keaton, so if folks want to get in touch with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, they can reach out. They can go to our website, www.txsuits.com, or they can call us at 210-503-2800. That's 503-2800.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me.